Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. When we hear about the climate crisis, it can often be framed as a future or somehow distant dilemma. But environmental justice advocates point out so many ways present-day discriminatory practices and policies have resulted in stark instances of environmental racism here in the U.S. Baltimore, Maryland, and Jackson, Mississippi are two majority black cities that have faced water crises this week. Jackson residents are still under a boil water order as of this morning after more than a month of no access to safe drinking water. And experts say the problem in Jackson is a decades-old issue. Now, one Connecticut author uses his latest work of fiction to reframe the climate crisis as inherently local, all while confronting issues of race, class, and gentrification. Today, Where We Live, Tochi Onyebuchi joins us. His new book, Goliath, envisions his home of New Haven in the not-too-distant future, ravaged by climate crisis and abandoned by those who can afford it. Like his previous work of fiction, Riot Baby, Goliath carries pressing real-world implications. Tochi Onyebuchi is with me in studio. Welcome back to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
And our listeners probably remember from your last time and from reading your books, you're a Hugo, Nebula, Locus, and NAACP Image Award finalist. You're a New England Book Award winner. And Goliath has been nominated for a Connecticut Book Award for Best Fiction. Congratulations.
Thank you so very much. It still doesn't feel real yet. I'm waiting for that to kick in.
And also, you're a civil rights lawyer licensed in New York and a comic book writer for Marvel. Can't wait to ask you about that.
I can't wait to talk about that.
Our listeners can join as well, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Now, last year we spoke about your novella, Riot Baby, and I understand at that time you were actually working on Goliath, which came out, I believe, in January. Both are pretty heavy reads, Tochi, but you also talk about and write about the process of locating hope. And the prose style in Goliath, there are moments of joy. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about the process of writing this book and including those moments.
Certainly. I mean, it's interesting. As many things as Riot Baby and Goliath may share in their DNA, I wanted them to be sort of polar opposites on a certain craft level. Riot Baby is very much defined by constriction. It's meant to be a sort of claustrophobic read. It's relatively short. Whereas with Goliath, I wanted more expanse, both geographic expanse. I wanted it to be a bigger book, but also in terms of emotional range. Riot Baby is pitched at a very particular emotional register and varies within that particular frame. But with Goliath, there are a lot more. This book made me laugh while writing it, a lot more than Riot Baby did. And that was very important to me, both in terms of craft, but also just on a spiritual level. I needed that.
And remind our listeners briefly about Riot Baby. So we're thinking about mass incarceration, the moment in time of unarmed black men and women being killed by police.
Yeah, it came out of a very difficult time. The first seeds of it were planted, I want to say maybe tail end of 2015. And, as you're very much aware, by that point, we are being inundated with media in our, literally in our virtual living rooms of officer-involved killings of Black Americans. And it's happening over and over and over again. And we're seeing in many instances the same sort of result afterwards of a lack of, I guess, reckoning, you could say, on every single level, whether it's with regards to the employment situation of the officers or even more high-level legal issues. And so it was very dark, and Riot Baby came out of this sort of sense of hopelessness. I wanted to write, in essence, a power fantasy at the time. And I was also very profoundly angry. And this seemed to me the best and most productive way of channeling that anger. And then by the time, and it's funny, actually, I wrote the first draft of Goliath before I wrote the beginnings of Riot Baby. So Goliath happened, I'd say I finished the first draft March of 2015. And it was already a lot more fun. And I think by the time I returned to it, I was, in addition to being a much better writer, I was in a much more I guess you could say, complicated or complex in the best way possible emotional state. And so I could contain, both a sense of indignation at the state of affairs, particularly for Black Americans, as well as room for laughter and hope. All of those things could coexist inside me. And I feel like Goliath is representative of that.
Mm-hmm. So Goliath set in 2050, and when we think about, like Riot Baby, the world building beyond allegory, right? This educated guess that the future of what it will look like if environmental racism continues. So tell us more about, world building in your writing and why you wanted to focus on climate crisis and environmental racism. Certainly.
I mean, it almost felt, for me personally, irresponsible to not write, about climate. It's so pressing an issue. And I think even from, what you were speaking of before with regards to the water crises that are currently being reported in the news, but have been issues for a very long time for people. This is something that we've been dealing with for a very, very, very long time. And it was actually, I'd say maybe 7 or 8 years ago that I actually started finally making the connection between climate and environmental issues and racism. The very fact that, during the summers, you will find urban areas are particularly several degrees hotter, particularly in the summer, than leafy suburbs, simply because of the presence of trees and the sort of profusion of trees in suburbs and their lack in urban environments. Little things like that hadn't occurred to me before. And then when they did, all of a sudden I was like, wait a second, climate is important. This is an issue. And so it made sense for me to write about climate, particularly using the toolbox of speculative fiction. It seemed very verdant territory for me.
When we think about environmental racism, even how high rates of asthma in communities of color because of highways that break right through their neighborhoods, so it is interesting that these issues are all around us and to connect the dots. And so in your book, there's exodusters, we talk about colonies, the Great Migration, presented as new phenomena in the book Goliath. But when we think about our history and the history of racism, can you talk about that reappropriation of the terms you used?
Certainly. I think all speculative fiction is about our now, no matter how far-flung in the past, no matter how far-flung in the future. We're always writing about the present moment. And, one of the points that I wanted to make with Riot Baby was the sort of interminability of the violent oppression of Black Americans by authority structures in the United States, and not just individuals, but literally police forces. And I wanted to make a similar point with Goliath in that a lot of what's in Goliath is actually happening right now. There's a section of the book that refers to Reserve, Louisiana, and this place called Cancer Alley, which has been afflicted, the residents have been afflicted with catastrophic levels of cancer appearing in their communities because in many aspects of their placement near a rubber factory. They're literally living in the shadow of this massive rubber factory, and chemicals are polluting their land and their neighborhood and everything. And that's a thing that's happening now. That was part of my research. And so many of, and that's just one instance of me literally taking a thing that happened in the present and bringing it into the future. There's another section where a hurricane basically causes a catastrophe in a prison. And that was a thing that has also happened. I believe it was either 2014 or 2015 in South Carolina, if I remember correctly. This is a thing that's happened where prisoners have been held in their facilities as a hurricane is bearing down on them. And so I didn't actually have to stretch my imagination that far to bring about what may appear on the surface to be a sort of apocalyptic future. The apocalypse is now for a lot of people.
You're hearing Tochi Onyebuchi here where we live. He's a New Haven-based author. His latest book is Goliath, as we talk about this adult sci-fi novel and set in New Haven in the future, post-apocalypse. You can join us if you've read Goliath or if you have questions for Tochi at 888-720-9677 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So a lot of heavy themes. You also touch on gentrification. So talk us through that and the storyline of Goliath and how you bring that into the book.
Certainly. It's interesting. I wanted also to make the point that, it's almost as though oftentimes we imagine the future, and in this imagined future, we will have fixed a lot of the problems that afflict us now. Whether it's along a vector of gender, whether it's along a vector of race, of class, what have you. But we take ourselves with us wherever we go. And so a lot of those problems will persist, particularly if there's no structural change. And so even when people with means flee to space, there's still going to be reappropriation of land that happens. And one of the things that I wanted to play with in Goliath, particularly in the beginning, is the idea of the frontier fantasy. It's something that we encounter a lot in Westerns. I had in mind while I was writing Angle of Repose by Wallace Stegner, which is this very sort of almost, elegiac like story of this family setting out west and making a life for themselves. And I wanted to flip that on its head. What if you live in this kind of boring environment and you figure that moving to this dangerous place, this enticingly dangerous place will, fix your marriage or fix your relationship or be an opportunity to, strike it rich. It's all gold rush mentality. And I think that will persist even when we've migrated to space. And that basically sets off the chain of events that is the story of Goliath. Mm-hmm.
We've talked a lot about the themes, so let's talk a little bit about the main characters, starting with Jonathan, right? The privileged space dweller who, as you said, wants to head back to Earth and thinking about the fact that he's able to do that, right? So tell us a little bit about him and some of the other characters in the book.
Certainly. I wanted to write Jonathan as relatively self-aware of his privilege. I wanted to steer as much as possible away from there being cut and dry villains or people that we weren't meant to sympathize with or understand or empathize with even. And I think one way to do that is to have your characters be intelligent, not just on an intellectual level, but also on an emotional level. He understands to a certain degree why he's doing the things that he does, and that it is having an effect on the people who already live here, even though he may not be as attuned as he's supposed to be to those particular effects. He thinks he's one of the good ones, so to speak. He even says so in the book, and it's one of those things, too, where I wanted to show that no matter how good your intentions may be, your actions will play out the way that they play out. You could say, I didn't mean for that to happen. I didn't mean to do that. I mean, that doesn't necessarily matter to the person who's harmed by the thing that you did, who's displaced by the thing that you did. They still don't have a home. They still have lost their land, whether or not you meant for that to happen. Mm.
So they're the gentrifiers in your novel, Jonathan, and then his partner, David. I was drawn to the character Link and the storyline between Link and Sydney. No spoilers, but I understand that character, Link, that presented a challenge for you. Tell us about him and why.
Certainly. He's inscrutable. And that was something that that challenged me as a writer. How do you write a character that doesn't know themselves? How do you access that interiority? And it's funny because it's something that I've encountered throughout my life. I know people personally who, have acted out in particular ways and then struggled to find a reason or justification for why they did the thing that they did. It's like, oh, this is just who I am, or these are just the circumstances that I'm in. This is just how things are. But there's a reason why you felt you needed to do the thing that you did. And when you have this character who is a question mark to himself, how do you write that? And so that was something that was very intriguing to me. I wanted to capture that, and I wanted to delve into this idea of this character struggling against that as the world is changing around him. And one of the catalysts to him becoming more emotionally intelligent is the character of Sydney, who actually was so much fun to write and actually brought me maybe one of the biggest moments, or some of the biggest moments of hope in the book.
I was just going to say that, speaking to, even if the world is burning down around you, people still have a capacity to love. They still want to believe that they can find a place for themselves, to have that hope. And so Link is one of the people not of privilege, a person of color left to live on planet Earth that, is dealing with this climate apocalypse.
Yeah, the bulk of the novel concerns a group of brick stackers sort of left behind in New Haven. And they come from the various parts of the country and have all essentially just sort of migrated to this place of relative safety. And it's very much a found family. And I wanted to show this community that exists the way that it exists and is made up of people who persist in the face of, this idea that things aren't going to get better on the outside. Their external situation isn't going to improve. There's no, overarching government or infrastructural system that will improve their condition. Yet at the same time, they don't just give up. They persist in the act of living and in the act of loving and engineering their own deliverance, in a sense. This idea that even though hell may be what you're going through, heaven is a thing that you can make for yourself. And that can be a terrifying thing, because it's like, wait a second, it's up to me. But at the same time, it can be incredibly empowering to say to yourself, it is within my ability to bring myself to this place where I can love, where I can, achieve sort of the highest degrees of human feeling.
There's other moments of hope that we'll be bringing up with Tochi Onyebuchi as my guest today, Here Where We Live, talking about his new book, Goliath. Before we head to break, I have to bring up Allie, or Allison, dare I say, the meddlesome, presumptuous journalist character. And tell us about that character and how, in a way, it represents, privilege that is more clear than the Jonathan or David characters.
Certainly. I mean, I think one of the reason I named her Allison too is that her
not Karen.
Yeah, exactly. Well, her nickname could be pronounced Ally, right?
Right.
And I wanted to, because one of the things that had fascinated me around the time that I started writing Goliath was there was so much reportage about the problems ailing a lot of the Black community in the United States. And a lot of that reportage was being done by non-Black reporters. And so they're as empathetic as the reporting seemed to be, and as sympathetic to those conditions, there always seemed to be this lingering element of zoology, of like outsider looking in. And that's a fascinating thing to me. It's really, really, really fascinating, because you're shining a spotlight on a particular issue and a particular topic, but at the same time, you in doing so, you run the risk of people bringing malevolent intentions or actions to that particular issue or situation simply because they know about it now. And there can be this sensation on the inside of, why are you bringing us all this attention now? Like, why are you why are you exposing us to all these people now that know of us and that can do us so much harm? And that's such an incredible tension. And I wanted to explore that, particularly through this character of Allison, who believes that she's doing the right thing. She really believes that she's helping these people by educating others, quote unquote, about how bad it is for them. But of course, there are consequences.
And the consequence is what happens to bugs.
Exactly. No spoilers.
Yeah, no spoilers. You'll have to read the book, Goliath. Again, as we're talking with author and New Haven resident Tochi Onyebuchi, this is a book set in a futuristic world, but the story weaves in some of the injustices visible in our world today. We're going to keep talking with Tochi right after a break. What questions do you have? Have you read Goliath or Riot Baby? You can join us too. 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest is New Haven author Tochi Onyebuchi as we talk about his sci-fi adult novel, Goliath, out this year. The post-apocalyptic story is set in Connecticut in 2050 after a climate disaster leaves planet Earth radioactive. Black and brown folks are left behind. Some work as stackers or wrecking crews. Their jobs? To tear down houses and send the bricks back to the space colonies where the privileged live, protected and partly cyberized. Tochi's book is told through vignettes around several characters, and he weaves themes of race, class, and gentrification as space dwellers return to colonize Earth again, this time living under a protective dome. And as you would expect, tension builds between these two groups. Tochi, I'm going to ask you to read an excerpt in just a few minutes, but I mentioned you're New Haven-based, and this book takes place in Connecticut, a lot of scenes in New Haven. I'm wondering if you can talk about, why you chose to write this book in the setting that is your home.
It's funny because for a very long time, I couldn't write about home. I could write about, characters in other countries. I could make up entire worlds, but home always seemed too close. Like I couldn't quite wrap my arms around it and create a fiction out of it. And in many ways, writing Goliath seemed like a way to launch myself into that challenge, but also level up as a writer. And one of the interesting things that happened to me emotionally while writing it was that, I came across so many places that I've encountered and spent time in and have developed a relationship with in real life that I had to destroy in this book. It was heartbreaking in many ways. There's a boxing gym I had to go to that is, in the book it's hollowed out, it's irradiated, it's a place where it's a place that people are feeling sad in. And I've had the exact opposite experience there. There are coffee shops outside of which horrible things happen. But inside those coffee shops, I wrote portions of this book. And so it was this very interesting tension I experienced. And I feel like I was able to write about those places in the way that I could because of how much I loved them. And I felt that I knew them in a sense, but at the same time had to do justice to them. It's this tension between, I don't know if I can do this to you, but I feel like I have a duty to do this particular way to you.
And you've also said that Connecticut is a microcosm of the country. Can you elaborate?
Absolutely. I think if you're looking for an explanation of any particular issue or dynamic along any vector, whether it's socioeconomic, whether it's racial, you can find that writ small in Connecticut. The fact that Bridgeport and Fairfield are in the same county, educational segregation housing segregation. It's all here. The town that I spent a lot of my adolescence in, the downtown area is called Constitution Square. And there's a portion, it's sort of ringed by storefronts and shops. And there's one corner that contains a spa, and next to that there's an organic food place. And then next to that is a Chinese food restaurant. And then next to that is a gun store and then a driver's ed shingle. And it's all that. It's literally all the same block. They're right next to each other. And that to me seems so emblematic of, a lot of what you could call the mishmash of the American polity. And so I feel like in many ways, Connecticut is an answer to a lot of questions that people are asking about the country, particularly the current state of affairs. Where my family lives is rife with people who voted for, the man who was president for, the previous administration. But it's a blue state. And it's, all these questions that people might have about why are we the way that we are now as a national polity? There are answers waiting for you in Connecticut.
I love that. When you're reading the book Goliath, characters visit Elizabeth Park. You reference Whaley Avenue. But there's a part of the book, The Letter from Connecticut, which describes one pocket of the city in a kind of journalistic interlude. Can you read that portion to us, Tochi?
Absolutely. New Hallville is bordered on the north by the town of Hamden, on the east by Winchester Avenue, on the south by Munson Street, on the southwest by Crescent Street, and on the northwest by Fournier Street. Dixwell Avenue, Shelton Avenue, Winchester Avenue, and Bassett Street are the main drags cutting through the neighborhood. The Farmington Canal rips straight through the middle. The late 19th and 20th centuries saw industry churn to life in the district. The canal gets converted into a railroad, and enterprising George Newhall builds a small factory where the carriages get built. Other factories sprout like weeds around the first, followed by workers' houses and a boarding house for the unmarried male workers. Guns come to New Hallville in 1870, when the Winchester Repeating Arms Company sets up shop. And by the Second World War, the thing covered more than 6 city blocks and employed over 19,000 workers. 1-family, 2-family, 3-family tenement homes surrounded the plant, built by real estate investors either for rental or to be sold on speculation. And when you have enough factory workers, enough breadwinners employed by a single industrial giant, you get butchers and grocers and barbers. Winchester becomes the leading employer in New Haven, so of course, it relocates to Illinois. A machinist strike in the late 1970s results in the plant being sold to the U.S. Repeating Arms Company, and by the turn of the new millennium, the place had laid off the rest of its workers. Yale University tried to restore and redevelop the skeleton left by Winchester, turning the factory complex into Science Park. But space travel became too affordable too quickly. Satellite campuses in the colonies grew into main campuses, and parents had less incentive to send their children to a domed environment where just on the other side of the shield, the air was so poisonous your chances of lung cancer rose by an average of 35%. Tax base shrivels, resources dwindle, schools fail, and the kinds of things that keep kids off the streets and out of jail, summer programs, vocational education, church programs, all of that follows suit. Same story across the state, same story across the country. The tax base left, but the guns didn't.
That's Tochi Onyebuchi here where we live, reading from his new sci-fi novel out this year, Goliath. I have a two-part question. One, when we think about when you're reading the book, this is the first time that you have a break from the character stories. So why was it important to have that, journalistic interlude there? And then also the research that you did writing this book.
It's funny. I have a couple subscriptions to periodicals, and having the print versions of these things helps me with maintaining a certain attention span, but also easing the stress on my eyes, not looking at a screen. And I love these publications, and in many ways, the journalistic interludes were the closest I think I can come to writing for those publications. It may be a while before I find my name as a byline in Harper's or the London Review of Books, but I can pretend to have done that in this book. They were important to me because I wanted to have them contribute to the scope or the feel of scope in the book. There are certain things that, by dint of geography, the characters won't have experienced or won't have knowledge of. They're living very much in the gutter, and so there's no way for them to have a view of the state of affairs, of the history of the place from 30,000 feet in the air. And these journalistic interludes were a way of capturing that, but also maintaining a sort of linkage between the high-level view of socioeconomic change and its implications for race, and the characters as they are existing in their present situation. Because I wanted to have that connective tissue. I didn't want there to just be this portrait of the future. I wanted to indicate in the book how we got there.
And the question about your research, thinking about, the history of Winchester, or even, there's a part of your book where there's a riot inside a prison, and, the work you did researching Attica.
Oh, my goodness. It's the very first time that I encountered Attica was in law school. There was a portion of a film documentary that we had watched talking about the police and I guess military response to the uprising. And it was the very first time that I'd even heard of this. But it was instantly horrific to me. And I didn't know that this was a thing that had happened. And maybe a year later or so, maybe a few years later, I was privileged to hear Dr. Heather Ann Thompson speak regarding her book, Blood in the Water, which is basically a chronicle of the uprising and its aftermath. Absolutely riveting work, and some of the best writing that I've seen on any sort of prison issue in many ways. And I was riveted, and I heard her speak, and it was the very first time that I heard Attica referred to as a civil rights moment. It had never occurred to me that that was a valid characterization of what happened, because you have this gathering of prisoners in the yard, and they're putting together a list of demands that are basically, a hop, skip, and a jump away from the UN Convention on Civil Rights. Or the UN Convention on Human Rights. It was literally the same document, and it was of a piece with so many other instances of what we would characteristically call civil rights moments in American history, and I wanted to do that. And so much of the book is caught up in the least among us, or at least the lives of the least among us. And it would have been literally criminal of me to have this book filled with these characters and very much occupied with this idea and this theme, and not write about the incarcerated.
I didn't get a chance to bring up Bishop and his role in the book as a spiritual leader and almost a mentor in some ways to some of the characters. Can you talk a little bit about him?
Oh, man, Bishop. I love that man so much. He was another opportunity for me to explore the history of this story, some of the how we got here. He was a sort of flesh and blood avatar for that function in the book. And oftentimes you can encounter people like that in a community. They're not just glue. They're, the central, they're the town square. They're the monument at the center of the town around which people organize themselves. And he has this gravitational pull. And it was always interesting seeing how he interacted with the other characters. And that characterized so much of the book for me. It almost felt like I was paying witness rather than engineering, the situations that the characters go through. And, his relationship, particularly with the younger men in the group, it was important for me to delve into that, especially because of what we were talking about earlier with regards to Link and this idea of emotional inscrutability. This kid that's figuring himself out or struggling to figure himself out. And then there's this older guy that comes along who's been through so much and who knows himself much more than this kid could know himself, and in his own way can try to help this kid along, not by being didactic or anything like that, but by being there. And oh man, he was such a complicated character, but at the same time, because of that, so much fun to write.
There's that one scene where Bishop goes after, I believe, a New Haven comptroller, asking for more food and supplies for the neighborhood. So he was the advocate too, and this comptroller, a partly robotic individual villain. Yeah, no, it's interesting because so much of government and even local government is absent from the book. And a lot of that came from the idea that, people will experience the effects of political decisions that are made, whether on the local level at, a board of education meeting or a state level or even a federal level. But there's almost no connection cognitively between them and the person making that decision. But occasionally, those people will enter into a person's life, oftentimes around election season, but, occasionally outside of that. And this was an instance where I wanted also to show a side of Bishop that, parts of the community hadn't seen and didn't necessarily know he was capable of. And it's one of those things where you see somebody do a thing and you're like, wait a second, I don't know this person. I don't really know this person, or I don't know what they've been through, or I don't know what's inside them that allowed them to go to the place where they could do this. And he's doing that he's doing this thing in service of his community. He's like, we don't have food. We've tried to get food. This is the only way I can think of to get food for my people. It was that was a very interesting scene to write. Yeah. You're hearing Tochi Onyebuchi here where we live. Again, he's based in New Haven. We're talking about his 2022 adult sci-fi novel, Goliath. More after a short break. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. New Haven author Tochi Onyebuchi is my guest today to talk about his latest book, Goliath, a novel about a near-future climate apocalypse set in Connecticut. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Earlier, we talked about the importance of bringing in hope. And there's a moment in this novel, despite all that the characters are enduring, where they discover the miracle of real non-robotic horses, bringing them from Stratford to New Haven. Tell us about that. There's something about horses, and I don't know. I'm not a pet owner, but maybe pet owners feel a similar thing where, the animal that you're encountering is a sort of black box. Like you can't understand what they're saying in the same way that you can understand human speech, but there is some communication happening that seems almost, in some ways can border on the celestial. It touches the spirit. It touches the emotions in a particular way that bypasses a lot of the cognitive functions engaged in when we use language with each other.
And also, every time that I've encountered a horse, which admittedly hasn't been that often, I found myself changed as a result, in some way, shape, or form. There's something magical about them. And I wanted these characters to experience magic. And magic in the form of something that, by all logic, is not supposed to be there. They're not these completely healthy, natural horses. Like, this land is showered with radiation. There's acid rain. There's all types of, mutated boars and animals that are just like, everything is grotesque and mutated and almost visually obscene. But then you have these beautiful equine creatures just hanging out. And I wanted to give that to these people. And because I feel like when you're in hellish situations, deliverance can come from the strangest places when you're not even expecting it. And it can often feel like it's celestially organized, almost as though, God or a higher power is signaling to you, I got you. I got you. You may not feel like it right now, but here's me telling you that I got you. I'm giving this to you. And it's a gift. It's without condition. This is me expressing my love for you. And the horses were a way of these characters, the least among us, feeling loved in a way. And so that's, I guess, why horses. I feel like any answer I give to the question of the horses is going to be an incomplete answer, because there's just stuff inside me that could be part of an answer to that question that I just don't know quite how to articulate yet, as long as I've lived with this story, because it's that deep and that fundamental and that emotional for me. But yeah, magic and love, I guess.
Earlier when we talked about finding hope and this idea of, the impact of the places where we live, where we can make an impact, when you think about the work of Goliath and some of the takeaways you want to leave our listeners with, can you talk about what that means exactly, the hope in the local?
Certainly. I mean, there's a lot of talk of climate change on a planetary scale. And even on a regional scale, if we're even limiting ourselves to the United States, we'll talk about the drying up of the Colorado River and why that means people in Los Angeles have to ration water now. Or, we'll talk about the water crisis in specific cities, leaving aside the fact that, these have been problems in, the metropolises all over the country. Or we'll talk about hurricane season in the mid-Atlantic or in the Gulf. But how are specific communities, how are specific neighborhoods affected by that? And I feel like that's where the individual can better wrap their mind around the issue of climate change. I don't know about marine isotope stages, but I know about Chapel Street. It's that sort of thing. It's a way, I think, for us as individuals to better encounter this hyper object of climate change that can feel so glacial in its eventual impact on us, but at the same time so immediate and inscrutable. Why is it so much hotter now at this time of year than it was 5 years ago? Like, I don't know the answer to that. Maybe the answer has to do with the carbon emissions from companies that are an ocean away or what have you. What can I do about that? Like, what am I in the face of that? I can't get ExxonMobil to stop doing what ExxonMobil does. I can't get British Petroleum to stop being British Petroleum. But as treacly as this may sound, I might be able to plant a tree in a place that didn't have a tree before. that, there's a symbolic aspect to that, but at the same time, trees, they can help with gathering and retaining moisture and cooling the air a little bit. So, I think that is a takeaway that I hope I'm able to leave readers with. Is that that's where you can, because you look at the enormity of climate change as an issue, and even the way that we talk about it, it's so easy to feel hopeless in the face of that, and of course rightly so. But at the same time, if you're looking for a way to locate duty in the face of that, or even capability in the face of that, you can look to the local.
Right. We just have a couple of minutes left. And when we think about even the title, Goliath, the inspiration from the Bible story, David and Goliath, can you talk about that?
Absolutely. I mean, the very beginnings of this story actually happened when I was in the West Bank working for a prisoners' rights organization, and the Arabic pronunciation for Palestine is Philistine. And I was like, wait a second, I know the Philistines. I grew up in a very biblically robust household, and the question in my head was, what were the Philistines up to before they started beefing with the Israelites? And then I was like, wait a second, what were the Philistines up to before they were beefing with the Israelites? And I wanted to flip it. I wanted to take this idea of Goliath as this otherized, almost creature, and take that identity and blanket it on a population. What was it, what's it like to be perceived as the enemy, or this inscrutable, almost creature that others have to come and conquer? What is it like to feel like that? In many ways, that's what it feels like to be Black in America.
You've been hearing Tochi Onyebuchi here where we live. I mentioned at the top that you're also a writer for Marvel. We didn't get a chance to get into any of that, so you'll have to come back and just talk about Marvel.
Of course. That might be a whole 2 episodes.
Yes. Tochi Onyebuchi again, his latest book, Goliath. What a pleasure to have you in studio. Thank you for your time on the show.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine.
I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show produced by Katie Pellico. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. You can download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Have a great weekend.